Back in 2009, I was a rash and irritable teenager. My opinions were really just the ramblings of someone who wasn't quite as good at putting together a cohesive argument as I'd like to think I'm capable of now. Either way, Resident Evil has been a lifelong all-time favorite game franchise of mine. But when a rash and irritable teenager is put up with something that they enjoy, they tend to have extreme opinions. And in the case of video games, let alone favorite series, any tiny little thing that could be marked against it would probably be taken way out of proportion. That being said, I hated Resident Evil 5 when it came out, but as it turns out, I miraculously got older, and with that came more rational thought processing as I reached my later teens and early 20s. So now that my youthful fanboyism has died down, I thought it would be time that I really dig deep and consider the following question. Is Resident Evil 5 really that bad? And don't get me wrong, critics mostly really like the game, but I mean from the perspective of a fan of the series. So, well, if the game is bad, here's a couple of totally valid reasons why I hated 5 back in the day. Oh no, they made Jill a blonde! It's too fucking bright outside! Sheva's annoying and her AI is stupid. Why can't I use cover in this action shooter that I hate because it's supposed to be a horror game? The plot is so stupid. Boulders! Wesker is a loony man. It isn't scary. They got rid of the item case, and the controls suck. Among other things. And you know what? Maybe a select few of those things could have made for a solid argument if only I knew what the word argument actually meant back then. The rest were, again, just stupid ramblings that can't really be used in formal complaints against the game. So with that, I think it's time I actually cover as many bases as I can with the game in a few different parts in what I'm now going to call an apologetic love letter to Resident Evil 5. Coming back to my initial complaints about the game as a whole, I'd say about half were gameplay issues. I can't say whether or not these are unpopular opinions, but I feel that I can personally justify a lot of these now, at least in my own subjective opinion. But let's cover the complaints before I get to the good stuff. Controls first. I find it interesting that at least as far as I can tell, nobody really complains about the controls in Resident Evil 4, a game that plays almost identically to 5, at least in regards to movement and shooting. In fact, in most reviews I found between the two games, critics seem to praise how 4 handles, yet pan 5 for the exact same reason. I get that tank controls are a bit of a point of contention for gamers, but I've personally never minded them. In fact, I probably would have liked Resident Evil 6 more if it did have tank controls, but that game's a story for another day. But even if you don't like tank controls, I don't want to hear a hypocritical argument, especially when people act like Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest games ever made. I'd say a valid complaint about the game's controls would be if they feel a bit slow when you have to take into account the large amounts of enemies you are pitted against. But even then, that seems to be more of a difficulty-related issue. Maybe this is just because I'm used to tank controls, but I rarely felt overwhelmed by enemies to the point where the controls could be blamed as detrimental to why I failed any given part. But just being able to move and shoot isn't all that happens when you're actually in-game. Inventory management isn't just important to this game, but integral to the entire series. And while I do miss the inventory of 4 and all the catharsis that came from organizing all my shit, I honestly do find 5's inventory incredibly simple and easy to use. Seriously, all you have to do is hotkey your items to the D-pad, and that's it. I know in a good chunk of this footage you might be able to see I'm using the egg exploit, so I have healing items hotkeyed as well, but even then, just wait for a safe point to navigate the menu if you have to go into it in more depth. One could argue that, well, this is an action game, so the inventory shouldn't be so frustrating to use or be so small. To which I think it's important to remember that yes, while this is definitely an action-oriented game, in its deepest roots, it is still Resident Evil, and tension and gameplay should still exist. And even that can tie back into the controls issue. It's quite the age-old argument to say that tank controls are good for tension because they make a stressful situation even more stressful. But moving on, I just want to briefly cover the partner AI. It isn't perfect, but it's hardly the worst I've ever seen in gaming either. Sheva, or Chris if you're playing a Sheva, is still plenty competent. She shoots like she needs to and helps you out. Yeah, she is kinda bad at item management and can be a bit slow to revive you, but these can be overlooked. And depending on whether or not you are playing online, these issues can be entirely missing. Or worse if you were playing with a bad player, but still, just get good without them. I don't know. If there was one thing I did actually like about this game when it came out, it's that it's goddamn pretty. There were some pretty big titles released the same year, but I honestly think that Resident Evil 5 was one of the best looking games to have come out in 2009, and it was early 2009 at that, so other games, you had more than enough time to beat it out graphically. Of course, it's starting to show its age now, but even then, at least I'm not sitting here like, this is what games looked like back then? How horrendous, her. But the big complaint for presentation here is the complaint that, well, Resident Evil 5 simply isn't a horror game. And yeah, I'd be hard-pressed to disagree there. This isn't a scary game. Hell, even if you look at Wikipedia, the king of all factual sources, they just call it a third-person shooter. On a side note, I love that Resident Evil 6 is referred to as a dramatic horror. And I get that horror is subjective, but still. Balancing combat-heavy gameplay with a scare factor is a tough scale to keep even, and the balls-to-the-wall shooting and the boulder punching just tips that scale too far to the action side. And while at one point younger me would have complained about this, it isn't a complaint any longer, especially when you fit it in with how the series is as a whole. When Resident Evil 7 came out, everyone was cheering about how the series was finally returning to its horror roots, and that once again, Resident Evil could actually be scary. And then you have chainsaw battles with evil redneck Ash Williams here.
Ooh!
Deny it all you want, but I'd argue that at this point in time, with the series 20 plus years old now, Resident Evil is a franchise synonymous with cheese. You could play the original Resident Evil and see something like this.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
And brush it off as just either being the first in the series and or where voice acting was still relatively new for games, but come around to the 6th main entry in the series, Code Veronica counts, and if this ridiculous romp of a franchise can still get away with punching boulders into your final boss fight taking place in the center of a volcano, all with this epic orchestral music blaring in the background, you've sort of veered away from horror, don't you think? But I think that's okay, because at this point, we've already kind of accepted how campy Resident Evil is, and I think that's what so many people love about it. It's ridiculous, and it doesn't take itself seriously half the time, and that's just dandy. And at that point, I don't think it really matters what genre the series is. If it wants to slowly migrate from horror to action, or even dramatic horror, it could still be Resident Evil, even with the genre changes. Perhaps it isn't pure Resident Evil anymore in the sense of the slow tank controls, limited ammo/inventory, and fixed camera angles, but again, don't forget how much everyone loved Resident Evil 7 and how it brought back Resident Evil, despite its massive overhauls to the gameplay. Elements of its former self are still in each of these newer games, just in different ways, whether it be its characters, monsters and enemies, Umbrella, its sense of humor, and so on. When all things are said and done, though, this isn't a game that shies away from the good old Resident Evil charm of not taking itself seriously. The story is grandiose, the stakes are high, with a planet-wide apocalypse threat in the game's final act. Loose ends are fixed up as Chris and Wesker have an epic final showdown, finally putting to rest the big baddie of the entire franchise. Sounds all dramatic, but it's done with such constant action and high energy that it really keeps me invested and on my toes no matter how silly things get at times, and I think that helps make the game memorable. Think to any Resident Evil game, and I'm sure we can all find at least one scene in every game that is just ridiculous and makes us laugh every time we see it. I know I can. And like I said in the very beginning, this is one of my all-time favorite game franchises. It's very near and dear to my heart, and I think that means it's easy for me to poke fun of it, regardless of how much I enjoy these games. And despite my problems with the game's story, I think the way it tells itself still really allows for me to like it because it is so easy to laugh at. I know these games aren't supposed to be comedic gold or anything, but they are often bombastic, and that's all part of the fun, even when you're scared when it actually is being horror. No game can fairly be devoid of any criticism, and I don't think Resident Evil 5 is exempt from that. This is by no means a perfect game, but I think looking back at it nearly a decade later warrants a much more lax opinion. Perhaps I've just succumbed to Stockholm Syndrome and Resi 5 is forcing me to love it, or maybe I'm just not some jaded whiny teenager anymore because, oh no, I can't have my favorite gaming waifu be a blondie. But would you look at that, it turns out that in my humble opinion, this game really is a complete package, even if it deviates from survival horror. It's a romp that sometimes stumbles, but at the end of the day, I don't think it should be entirely disregarded amongst the fans. It's big and stupid, but that's part of what makes the Resident Evil franchise what it is, and for that, I'm sorry for the shit I gave you 5, for this was my apologetic love letter to you.